our streaming media platforms. Just a little quickly here. I think I can add music actually. Let me go ahead and do that. See if we can add some music. Here we go. Music. No, wait, it's this. It's this. And then background music. Select. All right, enough of
that. Where did you get the original intro for Cypher State?
For Cypher State, yeah. I downloaded a full song from YouTube's RMA free music library, and then chopped it up to where it was just that bit. Mm-hmm. So,
hold on, because I've been through some of those files, and oh my god.
Yeah, I went through with my wife for like, I don't know, 2 hours or something, trying to find like different kinds of music, and stumbled across like 4 or 5 of them, and we ended up picking that one because it sounded the best.
That's great. I had problems like when I tried to do my own intros, I just couldn't get the music.
Yeah.
So I ended up repurposing the old music, which thankfully my content backers or my producers are, largely okay with. So that's great.
Nice. That's awesome. 3 hours. Yeah, 3 hours, she said. 3 hours.
Hello.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to another episode of Cypher State. Actually, this should be episode 4, not 3. Save that and then close. There it goes. This is Cypher State, a foreign affairs, foreign policy podcast that we look at a particular topic for the month and try to do a deep dive, or as much deeply as can be done in about an hour worth of time, with political pundits from across the YouTube and Twitch political punditry spectrum. Today, I am joined by Tiberius D. Tiberius, why don't you go ahead and do another introduction for the audience that might not know you, that's going to end up watching this at some point? And then we'll get started.
Yeah, sure. My name is Tiberius D. I study in economics, political science, and my claim to fame is knowing a little bit about geopolitics. That is my specialty when it comes to YouTube, and I do a little bit of that on Twitch, but not really that much anymore. Largely what I do on Twitch, and if you want to catch me live, is I largely am doing shows like this. I do panels. I engage with people and have real conversations with them where possible. And if you want me going like full nerd out, whether it is geopolitics or explaining why Commander Riker is actually a pretty cool officer, well, you can check all those wonderful things out on YouTube.
Nice. So Star Trek nerds unite, right?
Yeah, let's go, boys.
All right. And for people that may not know, my name is Cypher. I am the host and moderator of the Crowdsourced Politics podcast. We've been podcasting for about 2 years now. We were born out of a funky little debate community on Facebook. We started doing podcasting because we felt that our opinions were super important, y'all, and wanted to go to the next level of discussing politics in a form that would allow us to escape the vitriol and misunderstandings that's often found in text. So we started that, and we're on our 30th episode in 2 years. We typically try to do one a month, and we release those periodically. Cypher State, and we also do a news roundup every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, live on Twitch, Facebook, and YouTube, where we cover the weeks of news that was with a kind of analysis only the crowd can provide. So go ahead and check that out every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, except for next week, because next week is family week, and so we will be offline for that. But yeah, we'll go ahead and get started officially with the show with this little video. All right, welcome back, everybody. This is Cypher State, as we already said, and we are going to be talking about Afghanistan after the American withdrawal and U.S. and allied forces withdrawal from Afghanistan, how the Taliban have quickly taken over the country, what that might mean for the broader body politic, and greater U.S., Middle East, Arab, Muslim relations on the whole, as well as probably some smatterings of Chinese and Russian relations as well, because everybody wants to get in on this Afghanistan thing. So the reason that we wanted to cover this particular topic is because a lot has actually happened since the official pullout, and we're seeing at least to me, and Tiberius might disagree with this, but a bit of different kind of Taliban than we might have actually anticipated. Not that much different, mind you. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they're like good guys or anything like that, but it seems to be a bit more moderate than a lot of pundits had anticipated. But we'll talk about that. We'll have our disagreements and try to give you the kind of info that we can only provide. So, Tiberius, let's go ahead and you can start off a little bit about what your thoughts are on what's happened so far. Do you think anything was out of the ordinary or unexpected, I should say, with the Taliban takeover? And we can just go from there.
Sure. I'll actually piggyback off of what you originally stated, and that is that we are seeing a little bit of a different Taliban. Not going to say it's great, not going to say they're the good guys, but they are quite a bit more moderate. Now, when I say moderate, they're still killing people. They're still burning books. They're still taking women out of schools. I'm not defending this at all. But on the other side of that is that they've not been incredibly vitriolic. They've not been incredibly hostile to their neighbors. They largely are coming in as what used to be a terrorist organization that is now having to deal with the fact that they have to govern things. And it's actually quite interesting. There's been a few memes that have actually come out of this that I literally get run off on Twitter, where they're talking about the finance minister and how supposedly this person used to run as a pizza delivery person in Germany for the better part of 10 years. And now he's the finance minister in Afghanistan. So all I'll put is this, is that we are going to see a different Afghanistan than what we've seen for the last 20 years. Is it going to be better? Is it going to be worse? I don't know. I really don't yet. But it's not going exactly the way that a lot of people thought it was.
Yeah, and to do a little bit more of an explanation on this is that what was expected for the fall of the Afghan government was another brutal civil war, brutal and protracted civil war with the Taliban instituting an extreme version of Sharia. And even more extreme than what is in existence in, say, Saudi Arabia or maybe even Iran, right? And we're not really seeing that. Now, again, don't get me wrong. They're still whipping people. There's been a couple of hands being cut off for theft and that sort of thing, but they haven't been just outright in the streets beating people. And if they have been, the higher commanders have actually admonished some of the lower ranking file members for these kind of actions. Not only that, but they are being very open to the international community and not being as insular as they once were, especially in the 90s. Now, this could be for a number of different reasons. I think one of the key differences here is that the Taliban has actually effectively taken over the entire country. Whereas in the 90s, after the Soviet Union pulled out, they were engaged in a protracted bloody civil war, and they never actually had 100% control of the country. They were always fighting some sort of skirmish or long war, either against the Northern Alliance or against proxies from either India or Pakistan. And it seems to be now that their primary focus for this kind of conflict is against ISIS, and they've actually gone after previous corruption and doing a whole hearts and minds win for the people that they're actually trying to govern. And so I think it's very important that we look at these kind of things and why that has the impact that it has on it.
If you want me to add on to this, there's the only pushback I can give you on this one, because I largely agree with about 90% of that, is that I don't think Afghanistan or the Taliban have taken over the country, but I think they've taken over about 85-90% of it. There's
Okay,
two,
that's fair.
yeah, there's two regions that really get under my radar. Now, granted, I'm not an expert in this region, but this is what information's getting to me is that you have the Aryan peoples, and I believe they're called Hazara. You can correct me on that one if
That's
I'm
right.
wrong. Is that they've always had their own thing going on in Western Afghanistan. They're largely or Iranian aligned, or pro Persian, and they see themselves as an Aryan people. They've never played ball to a large degree with anything else that's going on with the rest of Afghanistan, and there has been some. I'm not going to say like conflict, but more of a lot of friction with the Taliban coming to charge in Kabul, to the
Mhm.
regard that Hazara isn't really okay with these folks, but on the other side, they're not openly getting into a blatant hostility. So we might see not necessarily a balkanization of Afghanistan, but we're seeing more of an autonomous kind of relationship. And then you still have the Northern Alliance hasn't completely gone defunct yet. Obviously, they're up in the north around, if I can pronounce this right, Kyrgyzstan, but they have lost a significant amount of their control in the country due to the fact that they're no longer being propped up by the Americans. That being said, to finish off, they don't really seem to want to have the job. They really didn't seem to be all that equipped whenever the pullout happened, and they
Mhm.
largely pulled up and scooped and went home.
Yeah.
So unironically, it's almost like everyone's happier, which is a scary thought.
And I think we need to talk about why.
Hmm.
This is a huge problem that has existed in Afghanistan since America basically went in and invaded, and that is corruption. Corruption was endemic within the Afghan government, all the way from Hamid Karzai to Arash Afghani. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Might have butchered it a little bit, but there has been there was massive amounts of corruption. People would do the whole nepotism thing with like police family members not enforcing local contracts. They would go through and there's money being siphoned away from not only government contracts that the Afghan government had control of directly, but also American military contracts and USAID contracts and the like for that. One of the interesting things that I read recently to update myself about what has been going on and the kind of things that precipitated this was that the Singar, no, I'm bad with acronyms and names, but I remember Singar because it sounds it has a pronounceable term. But one of the things was this whole idea that U.S. would be able to help the Afghan population grow soybean within the region. And I'm like, I read that and I'm like, one, how was this never talked about like at all during any media storm? Two, who the fuck thought that was a good idea? Afghan is arid. It doesn't have much water. They've always had to very much ration the amount of water that exists and used for crops. So they have to have water resistant or drought resistant crops because it's a perpetual dry, arid region. And soybeans they're water intensive. So who the fuck thought it was a good idea? Well, I can tell you who thought it was a good idea. The fucking soybean lobby in the United States trying to export more soybeans overseas. So what, like, come on, like that is just prime example of what was going on during the entire 20-year conflict. And I think that is like the perfect example of this. But Tiberius, I'm sure you have other examples for us as well that you would want to talk about.
Outside of just the general corruption things, and I hate like looking into these stories because they always just make me lose faith in humanity. And I hate,
For sure.
I hate doing that. So let me hit this from a completely different angle that I like to talk about when it comes to the Middle East. We in the Western world are used to what we call liberalism, and that has been built over 300 years of traditions and basically refinements and the advancement of causes to where I'm not going to say democracy is innate to us, but to a large degree, that's something that's really hard for us to walk away from at this point. Don't get me wrong, some of the stuff that we're seeing right now domestically does concern me a bit, but I don't think it's going to break down overnight. Now you get to the Middle East, is that they had a completely different, if you will, like cultural evolution. I'm not saying this is good or bad. What I'm saying is that they play by a lot of different rules. This is evolved out of what we call the Acuta system, which is IQTA. That is basically the Islamic version of feudalism. That largely didn't even end until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And so you have states like Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Persia, Afghanistan, Pakistan. They're all a lot more dictatorial, stuff that we used to see, at least in the West, about 300 years ago. And when the United States comes in, it's like, oh yeah, we're going to give you a modern style government with democracy and separation of powers. It doesn't work out very well. And I'm not saying that can't change over time, but when that's literally a nation building project, and it's not like engaging with Germany post World War II, where you enact the Marshall Plan and you build up, and 20 years later they're ready to go. This is going to take them a century if you're wanting to bring them to the standards that we have now. And that's always a big thing because it's basically like light colonialization. So I will end with that and let Cypher take it from here.
Sure. I think the only thing that I would push back on that a little bit, and it's not much of a pushback, is that it within Islamic law, there are elements of what we wouldn't call liberal democracy, but a form of democracy. Mm-hmm. For example, there is the coming together of a council of elders, and these go by different names. They have different kind of umbrella terms and ways of going about it depending on the region, because a lot of it was being like when Islam came into existence, it was kind of, they tried to do kind of what the Catholics did and take parts of different cultures that they could meld into Islam and allowed things to go on in that way in order to increase their ability to proselytize, essentially. And so there is some elements of democracy where they're able to elect leaders and that sort of thing, but with the overarching narrative of like a mullah or a cleric having final say on many different matters because of how Islam is basically structured. And it would be similar to how the Holy Roman Catholic Empire operated back in the day, where a lot of the church had most of the political power and they were able to wield it in a overbearing way to get what the church ultimately wanted. And so you see similar things like that. In Afghanistan, they have a system, a traditional assembly called the jirga, which is essentially a assembly of council of elders that led each village. And the elders are basically revered elder people, or maybe it depends on like the tribal traditions or the clan traditions of that area. And they would come together to try to create rules and treaties and whatever you want to call them among the different tribes in order to steer the country in general. And that kind of system was tried to be implemented to a degree within Afghanistan, but a lot of things like America has done in the last 30 years, it fell flat because not enough people knew what the fuck they were doing. So I wanted to that's why I wanted to push back just a little bit on that, because I think we don't want to lose sight of the fact there are some similarities, even though they might not be a perfect one-to-one.
Yeah, fair enough. And to describe the instance that he's talking about that I can picture, Iran has what is called the Guardian Council, and it is largely like the 12 biggest leaders within the country. That is, if you will, like more of a limited election super body. That they're more or less the guys who really and truthfully pick the next leader of Iran, which is usually the Ayatollah, if I remember correctly. And so there is definitely systems like that throughout the Middle East and throughout Islamic culture. But there is, at least in a general level, I might trigger a few people saying this, but a lot of what we see in how the ruling structures work is a lot more like what we see in Saudi Arabia and what we saw in Saddam's Ba'athist party. In Iraq, is that a lot of these are very top-down structures, and they're usually fueled by what we would call nepotism. Is, do I like you? It's really akin to feudalism in our old history, and like they have a word for it, the Acuta, which may have a different term for it now, but in some ways they are still playing by those rules. I'm not going to say that's a good thing or a bad thing, but you have to understand the context of what you're dealing with. And
sure.
I think the biggest deal is for the Americans is that we just didn't. We didn't operate that way. We basically were trying to impose our rules, and that is a completely different mechanic that you're having to deal with.
No, 100%. Like everybody needs to realize that. Everybody needs to realize in this kind of situation is that most of the Middle East is still ran by kings or some sort of feudal family. We call it Saudi Arabia, but it's literally the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's the house of Saud. The Saud clan runs all of Saudi Arabia, and because they control the oh god, okay, my mind is blanking. What is the holy structure where people do the Hajj to? What is that actually called?
You're talking about the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and then there's the
Yes,
Dome of the
Mecca.
Rock.
Yeah, I think Dome of the Rock is inside Jerusalem.
I can't remember.
Yeah, that's in Jerusalem. So they control the holy sites of Medina and Mecca, and because they have the control of that, they're given more sway over the rest of the kingdoms in the kingdoms or areas inside of the Middle East.
It also helps.
And that's why UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is largely a proxy for the House of Saud, basically. So yeah, it was something that we actually have to be aware of, because those kind of relationships dictate and impact how they operate with other Muslim countries, including Afghanistan and Pakistan.
I didn't mean to cut in there, but what I was going to add is that obviously it doesn't hurt to be one of the world's largest export or oil exporting nations. And if you will, in the political terms that we think of here in the West, is that a lot of these nations, and even to Afghanistan, are largely operated as resource exportive dictatorial systems. And one of the scary things about that in political science is that they're usually the most apoplectic governance is towards their citizens, because their citizens usually are seen as expendable, because the main generator of wealth is the exporter of a resource. And of course, if we're talking about Saudi Arabia, it's oil. Same with the UAE. If it's Afghanistan, it was opium.
Yeah. No, and that's very true. I think it's interesting that you brought up opium, because that's another thing that the Taliban has greatly clamped down on since coming to power. Before they were in power, like, hey, use whatever means necessary to kick out the infidels, right? But now that they're in power, they're going through and they're destroying opium fields. They're trying to get farmers to grow other crops, food stock, that sort of thing. And while they do not have the money resources to sustain an economy right now, which we will also get into the whys, but they're trying to not only impose that from an Islamic standpoint, but also from a what is best for the country standpoint. And so you're seeing a lot of that happen within Afghanistan right now as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And so there's like two forks that we definitely can go down. One is the economic situation of Afghanistan, why it's in the situation, not only the history, but I will absolutely love to chime into the geopolitics of where successful nations tend to be. On the other side of that is talking about why would they cramp down on like opium in particular. And so I'll let you, as the gracious host, pick where you want to go with this.
I think the economic situation is more pertinent to what we're talking about now, because opium is kind of, for lack of a better term, old hat at this point. Everybody knows about the opium situation, what it was being used for, who had control over it. And people that are tuning into this show, either now live or into the future, would probably want to hear a bit more about the economic side of the house. So just to give a little bit of context, and then Tiberius, you can take over. It's just going to be very brief. Basically, after the United States pulled out of Afghanistan and all the Western forces left, sanctions were imposed upon the Taliban in order to get them to still recognize the rights of women and girls, do education, and try to impose some sort of liberalism onto the Afghan government. Taliban said, fuck you. We want to be friendly with all nations. You're friendly with Saudi Arabia. They do bad shit. You should be friendly with us. We're the legitimate governance. So we're not going to bend to your will on this one. And that has caused the entire economy to collapse. So now Tiberius, go.
Okay, sure. So when we're talking about this general area, is that there's a lot of things I can add to it. Not only in the contemporary, people think, oh, does it have resources? Well, not really. Now they've talked about like rare earth minerals that may be within Afghanistan. Number one, it's actually not been explored all that well, so no one's 100% sure. And more importantly, is that people rhetorically have been talking to me about, hey, is China going to come in? Are they going to like mine all this stuff? And I'm like, you got to build the highways, you got to build the roads, you got to build the infrastructure, not only to get in there, but also to get out. And that's literally something on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investment, because we're talking about a place that doesn't have an electric grid. Like, this is almost away from what we think of as normal civilization. History lesson. Why is that the case? Well, geopolitically speaking, this is one of the worst parts of Asia. And what I like to preach on my channel, if you're interested in checking that out, is how geography dictates how you live. And there are certain places that have, if you will, we use the term technological diffusion. Everything is working out to build that into a geopolitical entity, and that is largely through societal technological advancements that are able to basically use as force multipliers, where you can build out a state, a nation. Afghanistan's always really had the problems with this. This used to be known as the area of Bakatra all the way back in the day. It used to be part of like Samardia. And what even back then was normal was it was always the hinterland. It was the land beyond.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the place that Alexander the Great passed through, the Hindu Kush, as they used to call it then, all on his way to India. And it was literally the Hannibal crossing the Alps of his day. Absolutely huge thing. But the question is why? And to answer this in a nutshell is that this is a very, very mountainous area. And if you think about locomotion and getting from A to B, if you're walking up a hill, you get tired really quickly. And that is literally the majority of this nation as a whole is literally locomotion is going up a cliff or going up a steep slope from one city to another. On the other side of that, climate also behaves to it. We already talked about the water situation. It's hard to grow crops if you don't have water. And there's only about 1 or 2 areas that really have any kind of substantive water. Everything flows out of this nation. There's no water literally flowing in. It flows out. It goes to Pakistan. It goes to Iran. It goes to Turkmenistan. It doesn't stay in-house. And it would require literally like massive hydroelectric projects, which this economy does not have the ability to generate the capital to create, to actually make that sustainable. And so I've ranted very long. Thank you very much.
Well, no, I think those are all very important points. I do. What we were seeing when the U.S. forces were engaged is that the government was looking for the people that would give them the most money and the least amount of regulations over what they do with that money. And so when the United States was king, they were going with U.S. contractors and getting U.S. development for like roads, bridges, whatever, electrical power. There was some diesel operating units that were supposed to be created. They were supposed to produce like 30% of power. They ended up only producing 1%. Again, corruption is endemic in this situation. We're going to keep bringing up corruption on this. But once security was established to enough of a degree, they started looking at other areas, other countries to do business with. And China was one of those countries. And China had gotten awarded a lot of not the development projects, but a lot of the natural rights exploration projects in Afghanistan. And that is when everybody found out that Afghanistan is sitting on a fuck ton of lithium. And lithium is required for battery power storage. Batteries, every single rechargeable battery has lithium in it. So if you have a ton of lithium and you're able to mine it, export it, and give it to people, you're going to have a lot of money. But as Tiberius was saying, this requires infrastructure, and infrastructure is just not there. So China, after the Americans withdrew, after the Western forces withdrew, has been sitting on the sidelines, allowing things to play out before investing a ton of money into the exploration. They have started up some operations again within the country, is my understanding, but very piecemeal, very small. They haven't come back in full force to do these things. And the Taliban, while they're okay with working with China or pretty much anybody, because there's reasons for that within Islamic law as well, for working with people that you think of as infidels, at least for 10 years before reassessing or what have you, they're still wary of allowing China to dominate the terms of those conditions. And so that's why we see not a lot of work projects being done right now, because the situation is still tenuous for everybody. Even the Taliban is still tenuous. So economically, I guess my question would be is what can we expect to happen over the next, we'll keep it short, over the next 6 months or so, because if we can predict the next 6 months, then we can kind of predict the next, year to 2 years, and maybe figure out some things that others might not be able to see. Excuse me. Others may not be able to see, or at least give people a bit of foreshadowing of what to expect.
Okay, so if you're handing that one off to me,
Sure.
is that I would largely go with the next 6 months is largely, I think, going to be continued consolidation of power and like getting their house in order. And I know that's very vague and very generalized, but one, again, not an expert here, but also on the other side of that is from what we usually see is that building out a political infrastructure that is solid, that doesn't scare the hell out of you at night, usually takes a while, 5, 10, 20 years in some regards. And we're talking about a nation that has largely been in and out of civil war for the better part of the last 40 years. So it's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of time. They really need to secure 3 things. Number one, they need to secure access to some kind of treasure. And when I say treasure is that we call this capital, we call this resources that they can use to advance themselves. What's this going to be? I don't know. I actually thought they were going to be they were going to take control of the opium trade, and they were going to use that as basically their piggy bank. They're not doing that from what I hear from Cypher. I haven't been a chance to check all that out. But if that's the case, that's their number one cash cow that's out. So what are they going to rely on? Crops here are really rough. They don't have an industrial infrastructure. They don't have a mining resource infrastructure. And they sure as hell ain't going to have a technological infrastructure. So I get why they would crank down on the opium, because that's still a threat that makes another power want to come in and reach the region, because drugs are a problem for everybody, any kind of major nation state. But without it, I don't know if they have anything to really export into the world market to go, all right, hey, we've got some resources here. We can help secure part of an investment, go in on this project with us so we can start building something constructive. So if they've got a plan, I don't know what it is.
Well, sorry, I didn't mean to do that one. I honestly don't know what it is either, because again, I agree with you is that they're still in the process of consolidating power and getting their footing. Whenever a government falls and a new government comes into power, without a strong civil society behind it, you're going to have people kind of figuring things out as they go, especially if the primary purpose of the Taliban's existence was being a resistance group and not necessarily a governing group. They kind of became a governing group even in the 90s by default because they were the most brutal and they again wanted to take care of corruption. Like that's always been the thing. The Taliban's been like, corruption is bad for society. We should probably take care of that in as brutal of a way as possible because fuck you. So that's essentially what they're still kind of doing, but they're being a bit more open to different ethnicities, different groups. They're even not targeting Shias. They're allowing Shias to practice Muslims to practice their religion. They also are putting foreign journalists under their protection in areas. They've like whenever a Taliban rank and file member has done anything to a journalist, or not, wouldn't say anything, but because you don't know everything that's going on, right? So you can't say everything, but a lot of the things have actually come back and they would call like the boss of that area, whoever that was, the Taliban, the higher Taliban guy. And the guy would come out and be like, what the fuck are you doing, dude? Stop that shit. Like they need to be able to report on this stuff. We're trying to be nice. Or, and sometimes that would include a beating to the person that just gave a journalist a beating. Like, so there's this differences that are going on here than what we would normally see, as we said earlier in the program. As far as economically is concerned, and I want to push back against my own point about the opium thing, Taliban is trying to tamp down on opium, but it's not being very good at it because, again, they're still getting their footing. So the opium trade is still ongoing. It's not a thing that's like completely been quashed. In fact, hardly any of it's probably been actually taken out, except for maybe some farms here or there. And because opium can grow anywhere, take out one farm, they're just going to hightail out 20 kilometers east or whatever, and there's another farm right there, right? So that is something to be on the lookout for. As far as 6 months is concerned, I think it will really boil down to how much the world will put up with the world's own inaction to basically stop mass starvation from happening within Afghanistan, because the entire economy was built around foreign aid. When foreign aid stopped flowing, the entire economy collapsed, and as well as the ability to import food to feed its growing population. Because with the stability that the United States came in with after throwing out the Taliban, their population actually grew. And so they don't have right now the resources to feed their entire population. So there's mass suffering going on right now. And the Taliban's biggest push has been for the last 2 months or so has been, hey, you were helping these people while we were fighting. They're still the same people. You should continue to help them. Or do you not care about the people you were already helping? And it was all just political. And that's been their push in order to get aid back into the country. And that has been working to a degree with groups like Doctors Without Borders, the International Red Cross, and a smattering of other, Norwegian, Swedish, and other NGOs that are like, hey, we got to go in and give food aid, at the very least, food aid to all these people. And the United States, under President Biden, has said, okay, we'll give exceptions under the aid to foreign terrorist or foreign problematic governments sanctions that exist around Afghanistan for specific foodstuffs and medicine. And so it seems to be that is working, that pulling on the heartstrings is working to a degree, but it's not nearly enough to keep the flow from getting worse, to stem the flow, to say. And so I think what we'll see is more death due to economic starvation, and thus literal starvation. And then the Taliban probably having to figure out ways to come up with the ability to create more revenue, which might be, to Tiberius's point, looking at opium again. But that might not be the case because it depends on what other countries do. Depends on what KSA does, depends on what China does. So, Tiberius, do you have any insight to what the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia may do? Qatar is another big player within the region. They actually successfully helped to negotiate the escape, I guess. But with the Taliban, they negotiated the leaving of the women's orchestra, essentially, to be set up in Poland. So what do you think might happen there?
When it comes to the international engagement and involvement, I think everyone's biding their time, because anything that happens further out is they're looking at the Americans and are like, they don't want to be the next people, right? So let me hit like the top 5 or 6 actors that might play into the region and where they might go. Number 1, Saudi Arabia. Their biggest ally in the region has either been the Northern Alliance or in some regards the Taliban itself. It's really weird. I know that may sound contradictory here, but the Saudis have largely been pro Sunni across the region, and so even people that were fighting each other, they would actually mutually support because they wanted to be in their good graces. Northern Alliance largely was a project of the Americans, from what I understand. The Taliban have actually had some better relationships with the Saudis, so that might lead somewhere, but I doubt it leads anywhere further, because the only people that the Saudis now no longer have any interest in supporting, or antagonizing, is Hazara, because not only Iran or Persian or Aryan, but also Shia, which the Saudis hate the Shias. So, table them. Next, Turkey. The Turks could play a little bit here if they really wanted to, but I think they have bigger fish to fry. They have to deal with Crete. They have to deal with, Cyprus. They have to deal with the Greeks. who are largely economically imploding, and the relationship with the Russians has been all over the place. Obviously, all going around there is that we haven't even got to Iran yet, but the relationship between the Turks and Iran is always precarious at its best. Remind you, these are two states that have fought something on the order of like 20 wars throughout their history. It's a lot of history, though. So let's hit the next one. Iran. Iran, if anyone wants to get involved in this region and actually can do so, it's them. And if Hazara comes under attack, I'm not going to say like Iran's going to invade Afghanistan, but what resources they actually have that are still left after the Trump sanctions, they would be probably willing to get some of that involved in this, in particular Afghanistan, in this region, because of the fact that this is their doorstep. And the only people they're scared more of than like Pakistan and Afghanistan is the Saudis. And so if any time that calculus gets in the regard that they need to deal with Afghanistan or Pakistan, they might leverage Hazara in the region to be more of a proxy for them. Next to the Russians. The Russians really seem to be largely focused on Eastern Europe. I don't see that changing, especially with the fact that they really built out a strong relationship with China over the last 4 years. And so there's largely, at least from what I've seen, an agreement where Russians are handling Eastern Europe. Central Asia is largely in this standoff zone where neither side's really pushing because they don't need to outside of One Belt, One Road. And that brings me to wrapping everything up with China. China is the most likely major player to get involved if they decide that they want to. But number one, we're talking about a nation that is more of a police state than an imperial power, an invading power. I'll remind you that this is a nation that was largely built up over years and years of civil war that really didn't even find its feet until the Americans brought them on board our economic system to oppose the Soviets. And that's why China really didn't even develop until the 90s as a major power. So when they're looking at Afghanistan, what's the conversation here? What's the trade-off? Where is the insecurity? The insecurity is everywhere, and the trade-off isn't very prominent. We talked about the lithium, but you have to go in and build out $100 billion at minimum worth of infrastructure just to get it out and export it toward the world market, which is becoming a lot more protectionist because of COVID and because China has been burning a lot of diplomatic bridges. So I actually don't expect China to be super on board with getting involved, and will only do so if they absolutely feel that they necessarily do. So recapping, most likely player to actually be involved, probably Iran.
Yeah, I can agree with that to an extent. I think China is going to bide its time until there's more stabilization and to see what the rest of the world is going to do in that regard. I also believe that you'll see some proxy negotiations, anyways, between the Taliban, Iran, and the Saudi Arabia, just because it's right next to Pakistan and it's right next to Iran, and it's another player within the broader politic that is the Sunni Shia divide, at least on a geopolitical basis. And so I do expect the Taliban to try to play both of those sides against each other to a degree in order to leverage as much as they can from it. One of the things that we didn't talk about, and you didn't mention, is the fact that Pakistan has been involved with Afghanistan since its foundation, it being Pakistan here. And Pakistan, there's been, I'm not going to call them reports, I'll call them rumors, because there's not any way to verify them, but there's been rumors that Pakistan's actually the ones that have provided the Taliban the ability to utilize the helicopters and other equipment that the American forces left that would be complicated to use. And so when you see a Taliban member do an air assault on an ISIS fight, like the ISIS attacked one of the major hospitals, killed about 30 people. They did an air assault. They had Taliban members jump from helicopters into the building and clear out the building of ISIS fighters. That was actually Pakistan forces piloting those helicopters. And so I think Pakistan is going to be, by default, the major player for some time. And what Pakistan wants from Afghanistan is to be another buffer, to a fallback buffer, if India ever decides to get froggy and start attacking Pakistan for whatever reason. There's been a lot of bad blood between Pakistan and India since the foundation of both countries. Pakistan was originally part of India, but it was the Muslim region area of India, and they voted for independence after India got independence from Britain, from the British Hajj. So the Pakistan is doing things within Afghanistan and still probably has a lot of pull with the Haqqani network, that is part of the Taliban. Now there's other Taliban network that doesn't like the Haqqani network because of its ties to Pakistan, and there's been fighting between them, Pakistan, and the Taliban as well, which is another monkey wrench in this whole situation. So yeah, I think that's who's going to be playing in there. I do think China might come through and start exploring some more of those resources because they want to maintain those resources. Whoever controls green energy production going into the next 50 years or so is going to be an economic superpower, and so lithium is the key to that. And so if you control lithium, you control that trade. So I do think that that's going to also be a very important thing to pay attention to for this over the next year or so. Now, one of the things that we didn't talk about too much here is the Taliban and ISIS fighting, and why the security hasn't been fully established within Afghanistan. While the Taliban does control, like Tiberius said, about maybe 80% of the country or so, there is still ISIS fighters in the western part. I want to say it's western part of Afghanistan, where they've had established groups there, and there has been fighting since America has left. With the most noticeable to American impact was during the evacuation of Afghan refugees from the Kabul airport, where there was eight American deaths and 50 to 70 or so civilian deaths from that complex attack that happened on the Air Force Base. As I mentioned a little bit ago, the attack on the hospital, the major hospital that's in Kabul, led to the death of 30 people. And so that is another aspect we have to pay attention to. Tiberius, do you think that the Taliban will be able to wrestle, control, and defeat ISIS from Afghanistan in the next 6 months or so? Or do you think this is going to be a protracted issue that they're going to have to deal with for some time?
I gotta be honest and be humble here and say I don't know. And there's two reasons why. Number one is that we addressed this in the opening, is that the Taliban has been quite different in the playbook than what we expected. And if they had been what we normally would expected, where they just basically come in guns blazing and they just literally just plow through anybody that they don't like, I would say, yeah, they would clear this up in 6 months. But number one is that we're seeing a different Taliban. Here's the other thing. ISIS is an enigma to me personally, because it is an organization that is very decentralized, which has proved them to be very effective, but it's also it's pan-national in a large degree. We've got ISIS operations in Libya. We have them in Syria, Lebanon. We have them in Iraq. We have them in Afghanistan. And we are hearing reports that they're all the way now in Sudan, and there's growing affiliations within Indonesia. What? Literally a pan-religious organization that it's effective and, basically blooming. Unironically, we haven't seen something like this in a real geopolitical form for 500 years. It's really strange to see this in this particular form, because I'm getting to my particular thoughts where I want to close out on, but a lot of people have been concerned about terrorism in the last 20 years. 100% get that. But I think the age of terrorism is actually likely to come to an end very shortly as the world gets more unstable with COVID and the changing trade relations. Is that to have terrorism, you need to have a very specific environment. You don't need such a vacuum of power to where the terrorist groups like the Taliban actually have to come in and lead, which is where the Taliban's actually found itself. but you also need a stronger enough central government that it can police the area so that terrorists can actually operate independently and not have to worry about being their own police, right? So there's a balance here. You want something
Hmm.
that's strong enough that can keep out a major repelling army, but not, or excuse me, any kind of like major brush fire. But on the other side is that it's not so weak that literally that the people that you're fighting now, you now have to rule in their stead. And that's where terrorism's probably unironically heading in the Middle East over the next 20 years, at least if I'm correct, is we're going to see a massive drop in terrorist organizations and activities because they're going to end up, excuse me, they are going to end up becoming the local governments if things continue the way they're going.
Yeah, there's some history to back that up. Hezbollah in Lebanon started out as a de facto terrorist organization. After providing enough civil services in order to win the hearts and minds of people, they became these are political terms, so don't take this as, but a legitimate government organization that exists within the Lebanese government as a partner within the Lebanese government, and also as a non-government organization within Lebanon that also is terrorist and tries to exert its power over the region with the help of Iran. And the same thing happened with the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, or not People's PLA, I'm sorry, Palestinian Liberation Authority. That's what I should say. Not the Chinese PLA. Sorry about that. But the same thing happened with them when they originally started for a de facto terrorist organization. After some time and providing civil services and working more along the lines of trying to bring a stabilized Palestine, they became more of a government structure, and as a result, de-radicalized to a degree. Now, I'm not saying they're like 100% de-radical or anything like that, or they don't have problems, but I am saying that like it's not so much a terrorist organization, of more of along the lines of like an opposition authority figure that does use some violence every once in a while. And so I think that Tiberius, what you said with that is actually probably going to turn out to be true in some areas. Like when you said Indonesia, a lot of those groups are liberation organizations that are happening to affiliate themselves with ISIS because for either they themselves are like a Muslim Sunni insurgency group and they want to be able to get the resources and stuff from ISIS or the Taliban, or not Taliban, I'm sorry, Al Qaeda or what have you, or it's another ability to recruit people in order to fight their liberation front. they're trying to establish their own state government. And so if these things continue and they progress to the area of where they actually start governing, history tends to show that they end up having to do more work. And this is actually a good segue into a quote that came out of the Wall Street Journal. And let me see here if I can get it on screen. Yeah, I can get it on screen. I'm going to share it real quick. So the Wall Street Journal interviewed former Taliban fighters that are now police officers. And so let me go ahead and share screen. Here we go. And then Chrome tab. Here we go. No, Taliban commander who launched. Yeah, there we go. Share. And then on. Sorry about that. It takes a second to get this going. All right. So quote, "Jihad was a glorious time. The fighting was hard. We ate a little, but we could become heroes," said Mr. Nassam, the administrative head of Kabul's 8th Police District. "Now I can't sleep through the night because I am worrying that maybe a robbery is happening someplace or a woman is being beaten by a family member." And I think that's just like perfect to what we're talking about. Like, that's the kind of things that they're going to have to deal with. And when you have that kind of authority, you're going to want to use it in a different way in order to help the people that you're actually being in charge of. Because as authority, responsibility comes into play, it does change people's perspectives to a degree. Is that what you're kind of getting at?
Absolutely. There's an old adage: the keys to gaining power are not the same keys to keeping power, and that's definitely the transition that we're going to see here. What I was getting at a little bit also that I do want to double emphasize,
Sure,
is that the world is changing and it's becoming in some places it's absolutely getting more unstable. I don't see the Middle East actually getting more stable in a lot of regions. I expect it, or reasons, excuse me, expected to actually get a lot worse in some regards. Now, I'm not saying like, oh, that's a good thing or anything. But there's a number of things going on within the region that are absolutely tearing apart their social fabric, but also geopolitically speaking, is that oil relationships are changing. We're seeing the change in not necessarily green energy, but in the transformation of natural gas for a lot of major Western nations, and including even in East Asia, that's changing the reliance on oil in the particular region. Opium has obviously always been a hot button topic, but outside of Afghanistan, it really isn't much of a thing. So the transition of that's going to be quite interesting as well. I'll put it this way. You've got three large players in this region that are going to be shaping what comes, and I'll just hit their issues. Saudi Arabia. It is very much a tributary empire to a large degree. It can't defend itself. It's there because it's rich and wealthy, but the moment that oil becomes a different mechanic, let's just say somebody shoots a tanker tomorrow, Saudi Arabia almost goes offline that day. Iran's going through a series of change because after the Iranian Revolution, they actually had a massive, what's the word here? They had a baby bust. They're recovering from that, but we're literally in the depth of the baby bust for them. And so people that are in their 25 or, around 2025, that are the lowest age cohort. And that means that their political system, I can bring up the files if you need it.
Sure.
But in a general sense here is that with the population demographics of Iran is that their political system is changing because their population is actually a little bit older, a little bit more senior. And you usually don't have people being very highfalutin whenever they're in their 30s. They're usually, trying to tear the system down when they're angsty 20-year-olds. Right. Okay, so Iran is that, and of course with the oil sanctions revolving Iran is that they actually became a net oil importer for a little bit there because of the fact that they were hit so hard. And it completely inverted their economic system. Now, the good news is for Iran is that they're not entirely oil independent or oil dependent. They do have a domestic economy that has been bearing the brunt to where they are now, and so they haven't gone into societal collapse. As that relationship changes, Iran actually might end up looking better when this is all said and done, which makes a little bit more stable region. But then it comes everybody else. The last people are the Turks. The Turks are in a really weird situation. And while they won't get into the eastern part of the Middle East, they will absolutely dominate the western part as they go into this new transitional whatever they're going into, because their political system is being completely transformed by Erdogan. And even if they have a democracy, it's going to be a very authoritative one when it's done. They're also flexing their muscles with what we saw in Kurdistan, which is northern Syria, where they're literally saying, hey, look, if we need to be an imperial power again and go in and police a place, we will absolutely do so. And basically, I'll put it this way. The Turks may have gone or left history back in 1920, whenever the Ottoman Empire basically disintegrated, but it looks like they may be coming home from their vacation. So I'll leave it with that.
That's a very important point to also consider. Tiberius, we're at about time. So you said that you wanted to actually wrap up with something in particular. Did you hit that spot?
Yeah, I did. That was basically the rise of, if you will, terroristic governments.
Okay.
Like we talked with Lebanon, that's the major point I wanted to hit, that I wanted to end off with, is that as the Middle East more likely becomes unstable, you're probably going to see a lot of former terrorist organizations actually become the governing bodies. We're probably going to see a significant decrease, not an absolute, but a significant decrease of terrorism within the region, because either these governments are either going to become more stable, probably like Iran, where they're able to deal with these issues in a strong and authoritative way, or we're talking about nations that are probably going to disintegrate writ large. I'm looking at Syria particularly. Lebanon's looking like it's right behind it, where they literally just fall apart, and whoever's there is either the local warlord or the local government.
Interesting. Well, but for my final point, I think what we should be engaging, and this is like a call to action kind of thing, but I think we should be engaging when it comes to Afghanistan and Taliban in particular, is that I do think that despite how brutal the Taliban government is and has been, even though they are moderating to a degree, that we shouldn't completely cut them off from the rest of the world. I do think that sanctions in this regard are actually counterproductive, and it's coming off as spiteful. And I think that what we should care more about is integrating them into the fold rather than pushing them away. We know that integrating people into the international community doesn't necessarily ensure that human rights are followed. See China. But it does tend to be better than the alternative, which is completely cutting them off and letting them suffer under their own brutal dictators. See North Korea. So I think that is something that we should do as Americans. If this is a issue that you care about and you want to see something done about it, the only thing that you can do on an individual level, besides donate money to an organization that's directly helping Afghan refugees, which we will hopefully on this program next month be raising money for, is to write your congressman and make them aware that you actually care about these issues. But with that, everybody, I am sad to say that we are out of time. We know that you liked what you heard because you stayed at us to the end. So go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe for the algorithms. It really does help us out. And if you do Discord, we are building our Discord communities. Go ahead and join the Discord. You can find the links up and below. And we'll have like contests and stuff like that going forward, because we are a not-for-profit and we like to do things that help our community integrate and be more fun and entertaining. With that, go ahead and also hit us up on Twitter at Crowdsourced Poll. I share memes there and whatever else I feel like, whatever's happening in the day. And it's an easy way to get a hold of me. And as always, like we said at Crowdsourced Politics, keep your head up through a political storm. All right. I am going to say like a couple things just for the recording. Welcome back to Crowdsourced Politics. Welcome back to Cypher State. If this is the first time you joined us, then you know what? I'll just stop that there.